If you love story time, then you are in for a treat, because today we're going to be talking about how messy accounting made a nonprofit lose funding. Now, this is meant to be a cautionary tale. I'm going to give you some background, but I'm also going to talk about how you can make sure that this does not happen to you. So get out your pencil, your pen, whichever one you prefer, and get a notebook, because you're gonna need to take some notes. This particular nonprofit is a very old nonprofit. They were founded back in the 90s. And so as you can imagine, it has gone through many iterations, right? Iterations of team members, of management, of board members. And what I find is that a lot of times when there is a consistent changing of hands, there are just certain things that get lost in the shuffle. Certain things that tend to be foundational as it relates to running a nonprofit, right? But we're gonna talk about fiscal. So this particular organization did have an in-house accounting team where they came in every day. There was no hybrid, no remote, nothing like that, right? It was a team of about, I wanna say 7 people, and most of these team members had been there 12 years and up, with the oldest team member having been there for like 25 years, right? And so as you can imagine, a lot of institutional knowledge, right? Kind of having seen all of the iterations that the organization had been through. But also I noticed when someone has been at the organization so long, a lot of times, you know, a lot of attention isn't paid to them. You know, they don't get professional development, right? There's no rising through the ranks, no career development. And so a lot of times that breeds resentment, but also it breeds complacency, right? The accounting, you know, that you needed, and just even now if we think about it, the accounting processes and policies and procedures that you had in place in 2019 will not work in 2022. So much has changed. So as you can imagine, if someone isn't really keeping a pulse on what's happening in the fiscal department, you know, with policies and procedures and how you're doing things, you know, you could potentially in 2022 be doing things the same way you were doing them in 2019, even though that doesn't work. And that could be detrimental to the organization, and that's what happened. So let's talk about it. So this organization was about a $10 million plus organization, and they were mainly funded by government grants. And I think it's important to pause here and just say, government grants can be complex to track, because in addition to all of the, you know, federal and state, you know, requirements that you have to follow, you also then have to be in tune with what the different agencies require of you. So if you don't have this process in tip-top shape, it's very easy to kind of fall off the wagon with what you need to do, right? So I'm glad we said that. So they were mainly funded by government grants. And when I say mainly funded, they had about 47 or so different contracts with government agencies. Well, here in New York City, right? So with different agencies here in New York. And so this agency is requiring us to invoice and to track things a certain way. This agency wants something different. That agency, we took an advance against. That agency, you know, we have to meet these certain requirements before they're gonna pay out. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of moving parts, but there was no centralized person who was keeping things in check, right? So the organization had recently lost their CFO, and then they had a controller, but this controller really was more of a senior accountant. It was someone that was kind of like thrust into the role. So she was not prepared to be managing all of these moving parts. Not to mention, there's a huge difference between managing an organization that kind of is running like a well-oiled machine, and then managing an organization that's on fire. This organization was on fire. And when I say on fire, what I mean by that is that they were butting up against their deadline for where these government agencies wanted their audit report, and the audit report was nowhere near done. If the audit report is not done, by the time the agencies need it, they will halt funding. And that's essentially what ended up happening. The other reason that I knew that they were on fire was because they had all of this money in receivables, meaning all of this money that was owed to them from various government agencies, but because they just couldn't gather their footing in the fiscal department, the money was just out there. And so when they brought me in, I will be totally honest, I was not prepared for the fire drill. I really was not. And this was also my first time working with a nonprofit. So there was a lot to learn. There was also a lot that had to be done immediately. There really was no time to get in and train and slow to learn. No, I had to get in there, and we had to immediately begin going after funding so that people could get paid, so that payroll could be made. And so bringing it back, right? And you can probably tell by the things that I'm saying, how I'm saying it. Like, that's how on fire this organization was. And from what I understand now, having worked with a number of nonprofits, this kind of behavior is actually common. And so now we can get in and get things, together much easier and much quicker. But it took us quite some time to gather our footing when working with this particular organization, because so much was wrong and so many things were priority at once. And so essentially, because the books hadn't been being closed on a consistent basis, meaning monthly, right? Because there were so many manual processes, so many workarounds, when the auditors were requesting certain documentation, it was a fire drill every time, because either things were not easily accessible, or we just didn't have, the supporting documentation, which meant increasing the sample size. The audit just seemed like that end date just seemed to get further and further and further away. And so that made it very difficult, right, for funders to trust us, right? So when you get audited, that is a way for, your funders, your grantors, the donors, the public to know, like, is this organization doing what they said they were going to do, right? Have they spent the money they said that they spent it, right? Did they actually receive these funds? It's also tests like your ability to steward the funds that you've been given. Like, do you have proper processes in place? Do you have internal controls implemented, right? So it really is testing the environment of your organization. And so an audit is actually very important, because it is the difference between getting funding and not getting funding. And so as you can imagine, the due date came where the audit report had to be uploaded into, I forget the name of the system. So here in New York, a lot of these agencies use the same tool. But long story short, the audit report could not be uploaded. And because it couldn't be uploaded, all funding halted. And I guess the upside of this is that it's not you couldn't get the funding ever. It just meant until you get this audit report in and we're satisfied with the results, you're not getting this money. And the thing is, you need the money to run the organization. You need the money to pay your people. But because things are so delayed, the audit has now been pushed back further, which means now we don't get this funding. And once this happened, the clock was ticking, right? Because now we had agencies giving us a deadline, like, yeah, it was supposed to be in now, but all right, we'll give you another week. All right, we'll give you another 2 weeks. But then if we didn't hit that deadline, the funding was a done deal. So as you can imagine, we're scrambling. And I am a former auditor. And so when I walk into an environment where things are messy this way, where I can't trace things, there aren't backup, supporting evidence, documents, it honestly stresses me out. I was carrying the stress all in here, like literally going in early, staying late, working really hard to get this audit out. And it sounds so simple, but it's really not, because there are steps to getting order, or bringing order rather, to such a complex process. But what it really boiled down to was that things had just been allowed to linger for so long. Something as simple as closing the books on a monthly basis was difficult, because we're getting documentation over here, we're getting documentation over here. There's, 5 to 7 team members. No one knows really what they should be doing. So roles and responsibilities are all muddled. So it was a mess. And naturally, with the department being a mess, then the reports were a mess, right? I'll never forget the executive director. One of the first things he said to me when I got there was, I remember the last time I got financial reports, and whenever I do get them, I don't trust the numbers. You don't trust the numbers? That is a big deal, because if you don't trust the numbers, how can we expect funders, auditors, grantors, the bank, treasurer, board, like, how can we expect other people to trust the numbers if you yourself internally don't trust these numbers? That was a problem, and that was something that we needed to fix. And so all in all, the moral of this story is that the audit did end up being delayed, and it wasn't by a few weeks. It actually ended up being delayed a few months. And while some agencies held on, there were multiple agencies that pulled out. And as a result, the organization ended up having to dip into reserves to keep itself afloat until they could get the audit done. get the audit report out, right? So that those agencies will let the money loose. And so it was a difficult, stressful, and trying time. And I really, really, really don't want that for any of you. Any of you executive directors, nonprofit leaders, nonprofit CEOs are watching. Your audit process says a lot about you. And it's more, I should preface this with saying, it's more than just, can you get things done? Can you get them the reports and the data, the receipts, the invoices, or whatever it is that they're asking for? They also look at the process around how you do that. So if I'm asking you, for items and it's taking you weeks and months to get it, in my mind, as a former auditor, I want to know what's the holdup, because you should have a process in place for when things are happening, they're happening a certain way. Documents are being restored or are being stored in a certain place, right? We have a policy on document retention. And so if I'm seeing significant delays, that already is a red flag, right? And so I really don't want this to happen to you guys. And so let's talk about some ways that this could have been avoided and some solutions that if you are in an organization where things are delayed often or things feel muddied and you're stressed, when audit time comes around or you're not closing monthly, we gotta talk. We have to talk. And so let's talk about some solutions and some things that you need to be thinking about and putting in place. So when we think about how an organization can grab hold of the reins and bring some order to chaos, we think about it in 3 layers: people, process, and technology. Because most times it is one or all of those things that is the problem. And so if we want to talk about this particular organization, the first thing was the people. You have to know that the team that got you here may not be the team that gets you there. And what that means is a lot of times when you're first getting started, there aren't complexities. A lot of times you don't even have to be audited, right? You just really need to know, what's coming in, where are we spending, what programs and things like that. It typically is, the month-end close process is very basic. But as you grow and you hit the thresholds for being audited, right? You're taking in a lot of different funding. You now have grant reports, you have contract reimbursements, and you have all of these moving parts. Your team has to then shift with the change in the climate, right? And so a huge problem was that, one, there wasn't clear roles and responsibilities. So if you have a team, you have to make sure that people know what they're doing, right? What is my role? Am I AP? Am I AR? Am I payroll? What is their role, right? And what responsibilities fall under that role? What ended up happening is that there was a lot of people doing the same things. Or there were people who thought this bookkeeper thought that one was doing it, that one thought that one was doing it, and you know what was happening? No one was doing it, and there was little to no oversight, so there was nobody to say, hey, we were supposed to invoice these people by the 10th of the month. What happened with that, right? And so roles and responsibilities are key. And even more important is it's the right butt in the right seat. So what we noticed was that so many of the team members had been there for years and years and years, and they had no career or professional development. And so things had gotten a lot more complex, but their skill set wasn't up to par. So one of the things that we had to do was stop thinking about the current team, but thinking about the organization, its size, its complexities, and what it needs. What are the roles that we need in fiscal, right? Because too often I think we like to think about what do we have right now and how can we make these people fit? And unfortunately, sometimes those people don't fit. So you have to first determine what do we need, right? So what we did was we rewrote the job descriptions. We determined specifically what roles were needed. And now the team we looked at to determine, does anybody fit these things, right? Does anybody have this experience, right? Are they able to do these roles well? Because as the organization grew, nothing had changed. And so they were still doing things like they needed to, years ago when so much was different now. And so if you're going through this, you just want to know how we fix things, it was like, first, people. Is the right butt in the right seat? What are the roles and responsibilities? And communicating that. We had to interview each person in the department, and you'd be surprised how much people just didn't know their job and how much people also didn't realize they weren't doing their job, right? And so that just also goes to speak to the lack of communication, right? Just people doing whatever they wanted to do. And so when we think about the three pillars, right? People, process, and tech, that first pillar, we're thinking about the people. Who does the organization need, right? What are those roles? What are those responsibilities? And do we then have those people? Because if we don't, then we know that we have to take it another step and get the right butts in the right seats. So that's the first thing. The next thing was process. Process creates order. When there is no process, people are just doing any and everything. People are scattered. This person is doing it one way, this person is doing it another way, right? There's no order, there's no consistent way that we're doing things. It's not uniform. And that ends up causing the fire drill. So the next thing was this organization hadn't had an updated fiscal manual in years. And I am not joking. The fiscal manual that they had on file was dated 1999. And so the next thing was like, okay, now that we have the people, we've addressed that. What does the organization even have going on? What processes need to be implemented, adjusted, changed, right? How should it be, right? Forget about how it is, right? How should it be? And so we literally from start to finish had to map out the entire, how the fiscal department needed to run from top to bottom, and created a process for each one of those. So how do we manage AR? How do we manage AP? How do we manage payroll? How do we manage the month-end process? How do we manage review, right? How do we implement some level of oversight, some internal controls? How do we make sure that this executive director, the board, the management team is getting consistent financials to lead this organization, right? How do we minimize the amount of workarounds that you guys have created because you've had no process, right? So that was the second thing. And then the last thing was tech. Tech. This organization was spending thousands, and I'm talking about upper 5 figures in money on accounting software that they were using the very basic of the basic features. And so much ended up being workarounds because when they had this new software implemented, there was no training, right? There was no one that sat down and said, okay, this is what we're going to use this for. This is how we use this. If we need to pull this report, this is how you do it in there. And because of that, they were just exporting the GL and creating all these manual workarounds and reports outside of the system, which one was affecting the integrity of the data, right? But it was also making things very cumbersome. So that's why they couldn't invoice on time. That's why the books were never getting closed, because the process was just so convoluted. And then you only had, out of a team of 5 or 7 people, it's like 2 people that really knew how to use the software. And those 2 people only knew the basics, right? So the other thing that we did was immediately we got training. So they were actually using some, what I would consider more high class accounting technology. They were using Financial Edge, which, I mean, if you know anything about accounting software, it's expensive. And so if you're gonna be using it, you need to make sure you know how to use it. And so we actually enlisted Financial Edge and got a consultant to help us completely revamp the software. Had to redo the chart of accounts, had to set up customized reporting, but we couldn't do it on our own, right? And this is really how it should have happened in the beginning. When they chose to implement Financial Edge, there should have been a scope of work, and there should have been an implementation and training plan that followed that, right? And so we got a consultant that helped us to clean up the file because there was a lot of cleanup needed, but then also to set it up so that moving forward, we could use it properly. We could maximize it, because also what that meant is that cut down on not being able to close the books on time. That cut down on not being able to invoice on time. And it also cut down with all of the manual processes and workarounds that have been created because no one knew how to use the system, right? And so typically what I tell most executive directors is that if you're having trouble when you think about your financial operations, if it's usually, I have yet to see where it's not due to people, process, or tech. And it could be 1, 2, or all 3 of the things. But very rarely is it something outside of that. And so we had to follow, right, the pillars one by one to make sure that the organization was able to operate, and to make sure that once we moved on, right, they had something that they can take away from that, right? They had a team that worked, and that worked well, right? They had processes that they could refer to, right? Things were being done in a uniformed way and consistently, right? Then they also had the proper tech to then support that. And so if you find that your process feels muddy and all over the place, I want you to think about these 3 pillars, like what's not working in these 3 pillars. And for you older organizations out there, it's really important for you guys to think about how your organization has changed over the years and whether internally operations have changed, right? What got you here won't get you there. And I never used to understand that saying, but I get it now. And so I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I know I added a little bit of humor to it, but it was a very serious situation, and it was one that caused me a lot of stress. But it also solidified how important it is for nonprofits to have solid financial management and how important having skilled nonprofit specific accountants is in this space. And that's why I'm so happy that Visionary Accounting Group exists. And so I hope that this was helpful. I'll see you guys in the next video.